Welcome back to the panel discussion, Guidelines for a Transition to the Hybrid Cloud, sponsored by Merlin International and NetApp on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. My guests today are Mark Zalubas, Chief Technology Officer, Merlin International, and Mike Dye, Chief Technology Officer for Civilian, NetApp U.S. Public Sector. I'm your moderator, John Gilroy. A lot of people toss out this term SLA. I first learned about SLA about 10 years ago with phone service because people want to have really high-quality phone service, and they wanted to. Now, what was interesting with SLA is you could pay for just as much SLA as you wanted. And so it's not a black and white term. There's a lot of different types of definitions, isn't that, Mark?
Yeah, there really are. And I think it is important to kind of get a definition of service level. So the easiest piece, and it's not included in service level, is really the functionality, although it can be brought down, is to say, what does it do for me, the thing it does? But then service level talks about those non-system requirements, things like performance, throughput, responsiveness, scalability, availability. Is it still around? Is it secure? Those type of things. And it is important because in the old days, and you're still doing it a little bit, is you used to buy your own platforms, and I knew I had to be running at 3 nines of availability, 4 nines, or I had to have a certain speed or performance. I would buy more hardware or more redundancy to give me those things. And now I just pay money to the service provider, the cloud provider, to provide that to me. So I define everything in terms of what I need, not how I'm going to do it. And that's the essence of service level.
Yeah. We talk about moving to cloud, hybrid cloud. Mike, there may be some applications out there that aren't good candidates for the cloud.
That's absolutely true, and you have to look at that. And it may be that it'll run fine in the cloud if you're willing to pay for it, but there are times where you have a fairly well understood, architected application that it makes sense to keep in-house, and that it doesn't make sense to move that up to the cloud. It really has to be analyzed. There's not a book that I can run to and say, these apps belong in the cloud, these apps belong in your data center. It really is something that you analyze your own environment and work with people like Merlin to help you do that, because that you want to have someone who understands the cloud, whether you're going to a private cloud, public cloud, hybrid environment. You need to have all of that well understood. Yeah,
2 weeks ago I had Dave Mihalsick in the studio, and we talked about DISA. DISA obviously has a lot of systems that not good candidates for the cloud.
Right.
Yeah, I one of the things that you can look at is some of these systems are so old that the cloud tends to start with a more modern technology stack, and they just don't run in the cloud. Some older mainframes, some older operating systems, some older code bases, and you can decide that maybe you just want to deprecate them and make them go away, or you want to rebuild them for the cloud. And so those are ones that are candidates later, and they're prioritized lower on the list.
It's almost like...
I was just sorry, John, didn't mean to interrupt. What it does is it creates that environment where you have to look at the heavy lifting involved in converting it into the cloud. If I'm translating COBOL code into something that can run in a Docker container, that's some pretty hefty work that we have to look at. And what's it going to take to make that happen?
Hey, Mark, let's diagram that sentence. COBOL and Docker in the same sentence. I mean, you're getting an award for that, aren't you?
Well, they're only one letter apart, C and D.
Oh, strangely enough, I was thinking about that exact thing last week with a customer problem that I was trying to solve, but strange how this happens, yeah.
You can't have a cup of coffee with someone unless you start talking about IoT, because there may be some kind of a device in the cup of coffee. I mean, you don't know anymore. And so by 2020, we know the number 20 billion devices have IoT. So what implications does this have for our federal listeners? I mean, all these devices, managing them, how to manage them, this data comes and goes. I mean, zettabytes, all kinds of crazy situations.
Yeah, and a lot of times you don't know how much processing you're going to need. And this is where the cloud really makes a lot of sense, that in the early stages of the deployment of IoT devices, you're going to get a little bit of data. And then as you start to add IoT devices and as you start to do more in-depth analysis of that data, more correlations and things like that, you need more and more processing power because the value is there to do so. If the value's not there, you won't do it. And that's why you had mentioned earlier about I could buy more service level than I need. You don't really want to because it's expensive. And so in this case, you only buy as much as you need. And I think that's what's going to be important for IoT.
Mike, you have all kinds of new words now. You got structured data, unstructured data, mostly structured data.
Yep.
I mean, what does this all mean?
Well, it's all about what you're storing. If you're talking about Internet of Things, it could be log data or output from a machine that's out in the ether somewhere that you need to be able to analyze and look at patterns so that you can identify crime, intrusions, and things like that. If you're looking at home directories where people just store pictures of Aunt May, that's another way to look at an unstructured environment. And then you've got databases which still exist today that have very rigid form and function that are easy to predict and easy to run with. Mark hit the nail on the head. In the past, I would go out to a customer site and I would ask them to tell me what your requirements are. What kind of IOPS? How many IOs per second do you think you're going to need in it? What kind of a latency? These are unknown questions today because we don't know where this world is going. And it makes it much more difficult to precisely architect a solution for you. And that's why we have to have these different ways of storing the data, whether we store it in the cloud, store it in your data center, and there's a new option where we can store it near the cloud, yet use cloud resources to access it. So it gives us a real flexibility that we didn't have before. And to Mark's point, I need more of something, just add it into the mix. I'll go online and check the box and I got more resources.
So Mark has a skill set to sit down with an agency, get a piece of paper, and figure out all these options that they don't even know they have.
Exactly. And it's about the interview process. When you're sitting down with this client, this customer, tell us what you're going to be doing and let's really think this out and understand each other, because it's all about that interview so that there's nothing left on the table, that you don't have any unknowns or any uncertainties.
My guests today are Mark Zalubas, Chief Technology Officer, Merlin International, and Mike Dye, Chief Technology Officer for Civilian, NetApp U.S. Public Sector. I'm your moderator, John Gilroy, on the discussion, Guidelines for a Transition to the Hybrid Cloud, sponsored by Merlin International and NetApp on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com.